Now let's consider something that Churchill alluded to, and then go back to those conferences between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union back in World War II, because really, the origins of the Cold War come from that point. Recall that during the meetings of the Big Three, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin, the Soviet Union had a few demands for the post-war world. Stalin's biggest demand was a buffer zone between them and Germany. Twice they had been invaded by the German army, and lacking any sort of natural barrier on the border like a mountain range, they demanded this kind of safe space to protect them. Stalin wasn't very specific about how much was enough. The Allies agreed, however, that Eastern Europe would be in the sphere of Soviet influence, but there had to be free and fair elections. Well, guess what? There weren't. There were elections, but they were not free or fair. Stalin beefed up the Communist Party in these countries and basically rigged the elections to deliver communist victories. And that was the last time Russians interfered in an election. Okay, another thing we have to understand, you know I was being sarcastic there, right? Okay, another thing we have to understand from these conferences is that the Allied powers decided to denazify and deindustrialize Germany to basically neutralize Germany. How is that going to work? Remember, Soviet troops took Berlin in April 1945. The Allies decided to split Berlin into 4 zones of occupation. The United States, Great Britain, and France would occupy the western side of Berlin, and the Soviets would occupy the eastern part of Berlin. Similarly, they divided the country of Germany into 4 occupation zones, with the Western powers occupying Western Germany and the Soviets occupying Eastern Germany. Now look at where Berlin is. It's in the eastern half of Germany. So outside the borders of the western part of Berlin, that's Soviet-occupied territory. Basically, the Soviets have control of all the area around Berlin, and then half the city itself. That's kind of a hard thing to kind of wrap our heads around, I think, but I think the map helps. I hope it does. Now, people could more or less move around freely within Berlin, provided they had identification, but that would not always be the case. It was in 1945 after the war was over. Okay, let's think about deindustrialization. This was similar to one of the requirements in the Treaty of Versailles after the Great War. After World War II, the Allies pledged they would break up these industrial cartels that had advanced German economic power. But what had happened after World War I when the economy collapsed? Well, that brought an opening for Hitler and the Nazis to take advantage of people's economic situation and take power. Within a year of 1945, the US began to ratchet back the pace of deindustrialization. The United States didn't want to break up these cartels because they didn't want Germany to have another economic collapse, and they didn't want Germany to turn to communism in that collapse. And just to speak briefly about denazification, during the war, Joseph Stalin proposed executing up to 100,000 German staff officers, and Winston Churchill proposed executing high-ranking Nazi officers without a trial. But American leaders were basically adamant that there had to be trials to demonstrate the rule of law. Criminal proceedings would require documentation of the crimes committed. Now, remember when Dwight Eisenhower went to the concentration camp and said, we need people to see this, right? So they have the evidence, they know this isn't unreal, this isn't fake. So criminal proceedings would then require documentation, so no one could say that these people were executed or found guilty without evidence. Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and Heinrich Himmler, all, of course, high-ranking Nazis, you know who Hitler was, all had committed suicide before the war ended. But from 1945 to 1949, the Nuremberg Trials brought 24 of the next most important Nazis to justice. One of the American prosecutors at the Nuremberg Trials is actually still alive today. His name is Ben Ferencz, and if you ever get a chance to see him speak, I highly encourage it, or look up some speeches or interviews with him on YouTube. I think he's over 100 years old, so he probably isn't going to be around much longer. All right, so while this high-profile denazification was taking place in the Nuremberg trials, on the other hand, what do you do about the millions of people who had participated in the Nazi Party? What do you do about people like the SS, the Gestapo, the military, the bureaucrats who made Germany function? The police and the bureaucrats were more or less rounded up by the Allies and detained in prisons while they awaited classification for basically how responsible they might have been for things like the Holocaust and war crimes. But early on, the United States handed over responsibility for denazification to the Germans themselves. Now, this might not seem like a very effective strategy. It's like letting the fox watch the hen house. But this process resulted in political parties in Germany basically abandoning Nazism, and political parties that disseminated Nazi ideas found no long-term base within the major parties in post-war Germany. Now, if you're Joseph Stalin and you learn the United States has not broken up industry and has turned over denazification to the Germans, you might see that as breaking these diplomatic agreements. Now, side note here, the Soviets also gave up on denazification, but not on the deindustrialization or demilitarization. But if you're Stalin, it looks like the United States is trying to stand up a capitalist Germany and strengthen the former enemy. Again, the former enemy that went against the non-aggression pact and invaded Russia, or invaded the Soviet Union, brought the Soviet Union into a war where they lost, again, 28 million people. So how does the Cold War play out in the early years? For the purposes here, I'm going to get us up to the 1950s. I'm really going to just kind of edge into the 1960s to talk about space. But more or less, we're just going to talk about the Truman especially and the Eisenhower administrations. One of the key questions that American leaders had moving into the post-war world is, what do the Soviets want? How are they going to behave moving forward? Well, George Kennan's long telegram seemed to offer an explanation at a time when American foreign policy was looking for one. Kennan was second in command at the American embassy in Moscow at a time when the official policy was cooperation with the Soviets, continuing Roosevelt's ideas. Now, the long telegram is one of your documents for this lecture, by the way, and I encourage you to read the whole thing. It is called the long telegram because it was just that, a long telegram. We're talking like 5,500 words sent via telegram, meaning someone had to beep, 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 tap out the dots and dashes for all those 5,500 words. But I digress. The long telegram was an analysis of Soviet and Russian history. It featured patterns of the view of the world by the czars and the Soviet rulers, and kind of looked for those patterns. Now, George Kennan had a history background, and this was deeply informed by Russian history. Kennan argued that the Soviet Union was fundamentally and unalterably hostile towards capitalism, but also noted that the Russian people really weren't hostile towards capitalism. So there's a difference between the Soviet leadership and the Soviet people. Kennan talks a lot about Soviet paranoia, and here I'm going to quote some choice lines. Kennan said that the Soviet leaders were driven by, quote, a neurotic view of world affairs. They were paranoid. They feared contact with the outside world, feared foreign influence and interference of Soviet affairs, and considered the outside world, quote, evil, hostile, and menacing. Soviet leaders, Kennan said, conducted their work, quote, in an atmosphere of Oriental secretiveness and conspiracy. This was a powerfully argued and articulated argument. Although they were anxious and thought everyone was evil, they were going to go on the offensive. They weren't going to restrain themselves. They would seek to address their security needs by extending the reach of the Soviet Union. They would look for points of weakness in the American and Western configuration of power. They were going to look for the right fruit that was hanging and just might fall into their laps. And they would use secret organizations and political fronts within countries to undermine the political legitimacy of elected governments. They would exploit anti-colonialist sentiment in the empires of Britain, France, and around the world, and above all, they would implement an autarkic, economic, closed system over the area they controlled. Now, this was an important fear in the minds of American leaders. If the Soviets expanded, they could cut off the free exchange of ideas, goods, and people. That would deny the West access to resources and people. So, in general, Kennan declared, all Soviet efforts on the international plane will be negative and destructive. This is only in line with the basic Soviet instinct that there can be no compromise with rival power, and that constructive work can start only when communist power is dominant. In summary, quote, we have here a political force committed fanatically to the belief that within the United States there can be no permanent modus vivendi, and that Soviet leadership will not be satisfied, quote, until our traditional way of life is destroyed, the international authority of our state is broken, if Soviet power is to be secure. End quote. It was a pretty stark outlook from Kennan. It was a very kind of black and white world, good versus evil. Kennan was the first to mention that the United States needed to contain the Soviet Union to prevent it from spreading its influence, but to do so in a way that would not spark an actual war. While the telegram was considered top secret, Kennan later published this anonymously as a report in an influential journal, Foreign Affairs, where he stated that the United States needed, quote, firm, vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. He's not really specific as to what he meant, though, so that idea was then taken up by the State Department in kind of a piecemeal fashion. Now, while we're talking about this overall strategy of containment, I think it's important that we acknowledge that while this was a broad idea, it developed over time and in different ways. In some ways, it was sort of cobbled together with officials reacting to world events. In the next lecture, we'll start to focus on how containment played out in the Truman administration, and then eventually we'll get to what it looked like in the Eisenhower administration.